and welcome to Local Heroes from Pendle Hill. This week, all my heroes come from the north of England. I don't know whether you watch or listen to the weather forecast, but sometimes the forecasters say that was the wettest month since records began. Well, one day I wrote to the Met Office and asked, when did records begin? And I'm glad to be able to tell you that the first systematic recording of the rainfall in this country began in 1677. And the man who did it was Richard Townley. This is Townley Hall, southeast of Burnley in Lancashire. It had been home to the Townley family since the early 13th century, but Oliver Cromwell took it away. However, by 1653, Richard had got it back again and began practicing science. He was interested in all sorts of things, but especially meteorology, the air, the wind, and particularly the rain. In 1676, he made himself a rain gauge, which he mounted right up here on the roof because he wanted it to be out of the way of all other buildings. And he described it in detail to the Royal Society. He said he took a tunnel 12 inches in diameter, I assume he means something a bit like this bucket, and then he fixed to it a funnel underneath and then a length of lead pipe which he soldered on, and instead of lead I'm going to use a bit of hose pipe because that's going to be a whole lot easier. There, that's properly fixed. And then he lowered down the lead pipe to his bedroom window, so that he didn't have to come up here on the roof every time he wanted to measure how much rain had fallen. And so I've mounted my rain gauge, just like his, up on the roof. And with luck, here we are, here's my bit of hose pipe. And he took it into his measuring apparatus. Now curiously, he didn't measure the rainfall directly in inches, but in pounds of water. And you can see here I've marked my cylinder, half a pound, all the way up to a pound, and we'll see how much rain might fall today, even if the sun is shining a bit. Here we are, look, it's raining suddenly. He realised the importance of systematic measurement, and so he recorded the rainfall 3 times a day, every day, for 25 years. In 1689, he reported his first 10 years of results to the Royal Society. Oh, look, we've had about £0.75 of a pound now. And his main conclusion from this mass of information was that twice as much rain was falling here in Townley as was in Paris. This is Pendle Hill, 1,830 feet high and famous for the witches of Pendle. As a Catholic, Townley wasn't welcome in London. Instead, he stayed in Lancashire and enjoyed inviting other philosophers to visit him. Richard Townley climbed up Pendle Hill with his friend Henry Power on the 27th of April 1661, and they carried with them a long glass tube and a bottle of mercury. They were interested in the spring of the air, and they had a suspicion, which they wanted to investigate, that if you took a fixed mass of air, like I've got inside this bicycle pump, then if you increased the pressure, the volume got less, and if you lessened the pressure, the volume got greater. They wondered whether the springiness of the air would make it expand of its own accord as the pressure decreased when they went up the hill. Richard Townley and Henry Power brought up Pendle Hill some valley air, and they found that when they got up here where the pressure is lower, the volume had increased, the air had expanded. So then they collected some mountain air from here and they took it down, and sure enough, the volume decreased because the pressure down there is higher. And they were delighted by this, and so was Robert Boyle, who was very interested and wrote it all up in 1663, a couple of years later. Ever since then, this relationship between pressure and volume has been called Boyle's law. But in fact, Isaac Newton and Robert Boyle himself called it Mr. Townley's hypothesis. Most people think of the Victorian era as the age of steam, and yet there was another revolution going on at the same time. In 1820, the Danish scientist Hans Christian Ørsted had shown that if you pass an electric current through a wire near a compass, the needle kicks. Do you see that? It's twitching as the current flows. And what's happening is you're making a new magnetic field by the current flowing through the wire. And so he invented the science of electromagnetism. Now, the work was carried on by people like Ampere and Faraday, but I was surprised to find that the most important practical advances were made by a man who was born here in Whittington, near Kirby Lonsdale, in 1783. He was a poor cobbler's son, he never went to school, and yet he invented the electric motor. His name was William Sturgeon. Sturgeon's father was an idle cobbler who treated his son dreadfully following his wife's death. He even used to take him poaching at Devil's Bridge. Local legend has it that one night there was a terrible storm and they sheltered from the rain under the bridge, and all around lightning was flashing like mad. And William was inspired by the lightning to study nature's electricity. By the time he was 19, Sturgeon had had enough of the life of a poor shoemaker and escaped by joining the army. He borrowed books from officers in return for mending their shoes. When he left the army, Sturgeon devoted his life to the electricity and the newfangled science of electromagnetism. He made his living by demonstrating smart apparatus to the public. In 1847, the annals of Kirby Lonsdale Church report an advertisement that he was going to give a series of lectures at this very pub, which was then called the Green Dragon. They were about electricity and optics. And the advertisement promised that the room would be warmed and of a proper temperature. Well, let's find out whether it still is. In 1823, he turned Oersted's idea into a practical device, the electromagnet. He already knew that if you pass a current along a wire, you get a magnetic field. But he had two cunning ideas. First, coil the wire into a coil to concentrate the field, and then concentrate it further by wrapping it round a piece of iron. Well, I'm actually using a steel bolt, but the effect is much the same. Now, if you look, that is not magnetic. But if I pass a current through this coil, watch what happens. Look at that. I've got a powerful electromagnet. He made a magnet strong enough to pick up its own weight in iron, much the strongest magnet that had been made at that point. Then he thought, wouldn't it be great if you could use both ends of the magnet, because the magnetic force is concentrated at the ends, the poles here. And he wondered how to do that, and then he came up with a brilliantly simple solution. You bend it round into a horseshoe. So here we have another steel bolt with a coil of wire around it, and here are the two ends, so we can use them both. So, like that, and now it's quite powerful. We may even be able to pick up a third bolt. Let's just try this. Look at that. We've got a powerful electromagnet. With his, he was able to pick up 20 times the weight of the magnet. With his electromagnet, Sturgeon went on to invent the world's first electric motor. Michael Faraday got a magnetic needle spinning in a dish of mercury, but it was only a toy. Now, here is one of Sturgeon's horseshoe electromagnets, and here is another one mounted on a shaft so it can rotate. And I'm going to connect them both up like this. That one to this battery, and this one to this battery. And you can see these magnets are attracted to one another. But if I reverse the connections, the opposite happens, and they're repelled. So if you hold them together, they spin apart. And he realized that if he could arrange that this spun round, and at the same time he could change the connections on the battery, he could make it attract, repel, and so what would happen? It would go attract, repel, and it would spin on, and there would be an electric motor. But how was he going to do these connections? How could they possibly switch at exactly the right time? And then he realized he could use the shaft as the switch, and he invented this brilliant device, the commutator. Now, actually, it's just a piece of copper pipe jammed onto this broomstick, and I've sawn two gaps in it. You see, look, there's one gap there, and there's one gap there. One half is connected to one end of this wire, and the other half is connected to the other half of this wire. So as this turns round, I supply power to these terminals here. The brass battery wire on this side is connected alternately to the left, then the right, then the left side of the magnet. The battery wire on the other side switches at exactly the same time, but to the opposite side of the magnet. So with a bit of luck, and look at that, an electric motor. Isn't that absolutely brilliant? The brilliant part are the horseshoe magnet and the commutator, which switches the battery connections each time it turns round. And so with this device, the cobbler's son from Whittington produced the world's first practical electric motor. Despite this amazing achievement, the motor didn't actually make him any money. He was eventually reduced to pushing his apparatus around Manchester in a cart, earning a meagre wage from occasional lectures. Although his funeral was attended by famous scientists, including James Joule, who had enormous respect for him, he didn't get any credit for all his work during his lifetime. And it wasn't much better after he died. His gravestone here was completely lost for many decades and turned up only about 5 years ago when a gardener uncovered it by chance. And all it says on it is William Sturgeon, the electrician. But Sturgeon's improvements and adaptations did for electrical power what James Watt had done for steam. And now, electric motors of Sturgeon's design are found in everything from hairdryers to bicycles. Some of the things I have to do in pursuit of my heroes are fairly dangerous, and others are just downright silly. And this, well, this is a bit of each, really. I've never before imitated a frog sitting on a lily pad. It was actually a lily leaf that inspired my next hero and joined the two great branches of his life. He was a brilliant gardener, and he also built the Crystal Palace for the Great Exhibition of 1851. His name was Joseph Paxton. When he left school, Joseph was sent to work on his brother's farm, where he was beaten and starved, but not paid. When he was 17, he ran away to be a gardener. One day, he bumped into the Duke of Devonshire, who took a liking to the 23-year-old lad and made him superintendent at his country home, Chatsworth House in Derbyshire. On his first day at Chatsworth, Paxton arrived at 4:30 a.m, climbed over the walls, explored the grounds, set the men to work, watched the waterworks in action, joined the housekeeper, Mrs. Gregory, for breakfast, met her niece, Sarah Brown, and fell instantly in love. They eventually married and had a daughter. And all this was before 9 o'clock in the morning. The Duke gave Paxton a free hand on the estate and said he could do whatever he liked. And Paxton was very fond of fountains. Now, he didn't use pumps or anything. There's a great reservoir up on top of the hill, and he brought the water down in pipes, and all you have to do is turn on a tap, like this, and the fountain starts. This is the big one. If you turn it right on, it'll go up to 270 feet, twice the height of Nelson's Column. But you've got little ones all over the grounds, and there's a wonderful cascade just up the hill. And what I think is wonderful is that the whole thing is done just using gravity. So, just as the water system in most houses is pressurised by a tank in the roof, Chatsworth is pressurised by a reservoir on top of the hill. The fountain can go almost as high as the reservoir. In 1837, the year Victoria became Queen, a traveller brought back a fantastic new lily from Guyana. Unfortunately, the people at Kew Gardens couldn't get it to grow, but Paxton got hold of a cutting and he grew it right here at Chatsworth. But when it did grow, the rate of growth staggered him. In 3 months, he went from this size to this size. He got 11 leaves, each of which was 5 feet across. He named the lily Victoria Regia, and he gave a bud to the Queen. With 11 leaves like this, he obviously needed a huge pool to grow the thing in, and a vast greenhouse overhead. Nobody had ever built a greenhouse that big. And he needed a structure for his greenhouse, some rigid, very strong structure, but very simple, just to hold the glass up. And he pondered about this, and in the end, he took his inspiration from the lily leaf. He looked underneath, and what he found was that there were radial ribs like this, very strong and rigid, and then across there were flexible cross ribs, which hold them together, and the result is very strong. And to test how strong it was, he actually stood his 7-year-old daughter on a lily pad, and it held her weight. So he took his inspiration for the structure of the greenhouse from the structure of the lily leaf. So he built himself a beautiful greenhouse. He used wood because it was light and cheap, and glass, which people had just started making in large quantities. And he used the same sort of construction as the lily leaf, with great thick ribs running one way and light, flexible ribs holding them together. Now, one of the problems he had to contend with was rain. Obviously, on a big greenhouse, there was going to be a lot of rain falling. So he used this ridge and valley construction so that all the rain would collect in the valleys and then run along in these gutters. And they were more cunning than that, because if you look, there's a hole in the gutter, and that goes through into this, which looks like just a pillar, but is actually a drain pipe. He made his out of cast iron. However, the really clever thing about this whole design was that it was modular. It was made of interchangeable parts. These bits were all manufactured separately in a factory and then brought to the site in a truck. And from these parts, you could make a whole range of greenhouses. And you could build them very quickly and very cheaply, and then if you wanted, you could take them down again afterwards. George Stephenson and Isambard Kingdom Brunel had just rejected all 245 competition entries for the Great Exhibition Building in Hyde Park and substituted their own, which, not surprisingly, looked like an enormous railway station. It was so ugly it was turned down by public outcry, so Paxton came to the rescue. Within 9 days he had on our desks a stunning version of his lily-leaf supported greenhouse. It was simple and cheap, and so flexible he built it round 2 elm trees after people objected to their being cut down. The building was a bit like the Millennium Dome of 1851. It attracted enormous interest and attention and disapproval in the press. They said it would attract thieves and vagabonds and prostitutes, but actually they were entirely wrong. Punch dubbed it the Crystal Palace sneeringly, but the name stuck and it was a huge success. Hundreds of thousands of people came, and afterwards Paxton was knighted and became Sir Joseph Paxton. One of the most basic engineering tools of all is the hammer. Of course, there are lots of sorts of hammer. In fact, in 1867, Karl Marx found that 500 different types of hammer were being made in Birmingham alone. But nevertheless, the basic principle is very simple. There's a lump of iron on the end and a handle, and you use it to hit things with. However, the man who set up his first engineering shop in this very building in Dale Street in Manchester revolutionized the humble hammer and so invented one of the most important engineering tools of the age of steam. His name was James Naismith. James Naismith was the son of an Edinburgh artist. He loved spending time in iron foundries, so by the time he was a teenager, he was accomplished at working in metal. He got a place with the country's greatest engineer, Henry Maudslay, in London, before setting up on his own here in Manchester. James Naismith became famous for his machine tools. He also made engines up there on the first floor. Unfortunately, one of those engines was so big and so heavy that it crashed straight through the floor into the glassworks underneath, which wasn't at all popular with the landlord, and Naismith had to leave in a bit of a hurry. He moved here to the Bridgewater Foundry, then in the countryside at Patricroft, outside Manchester. Although machine tools were used for precision work, the basic job of forging iron was done as blacksmiths did it, with hot metal and a hammer. Now, people have been working iron like this for thousands of years, and basically the technique's quite simple. You get it red hot, and then you bash it with a hammer, although you have to bash it quite hard. The problem comes when you want to tackle a really big job, because you can't do that with a little hammer like this. And Naismith's great challenge came in 1839. Naismith had a letter from Mr. Humphreys of the Great Western Steamship Company. They were building the Great Britain in Bristol, the biggest iron ship that had ever been known. She had paddle wheels, one on each side, and they wanted an enormous shaft to go from one paddle wheel to the other. It was the biggest forging that had ever been done in the country, and they couldn't find anyone to do it. So they wrote to Naismith and said, "Have you got any ideas?" There were already mechanical hammers around when Naismith came along, because after all, you could only get in so much work by hand. What you needed was to be able to lift great big hammers. Now, what they usually used was a tilt hammer or helve hammer like this. Imagine this is 5 tons worth, and all you have to do is turn this wheel, And every time it does a quarter of a turn, it lifts the hammer up and drops it, because these cams lift the shaft of the hammer and then drop it. They were fine for small pieces of work, like, say, the point of this poker. But when you tried a big one, just look and see what happens. You want to hammer that, you get a pathetic little bash. Naismith realised immediately that something new was required. He took out his scheme book and, in little more than half an hour, I had the whole contrivance in all its details before me. The idea was terribly simple. The hammer was not hinged, but ran up and down. It was raised up by steam under a piston and allowed to drop by releasing the steam pressure with a valve. He sent the plans off to Mr. Brunel, chief engineer at the steamship company, who heartily approved. But the steam hammer didn't get built. Brunel changed his mind and decided to use not the old-fashioned paddle wheels, but the newfangled screw propeller, so he didn't need a shaft right across the ship. What's more, the arm trade took a downturn at about that time, so Naismith's steam hammer remained just a doodle in his scheme book. In 1842, he visited the Creusot factory in France, and he was amazed by the quality of their big forgings. He asked how they'd been made, and the answer astonished him. The huge forgings in France had been made with his own steam hammer. The chief engineer at Creusot had visited Patricroft while Naismith was away, had been shown the plans in the scheme book, and had pinched the idea for himself. Just as Naismith imagined, the new hammer not only wielded extraordinary force, it could be controlled with amazing delicacy. With fingertip control, 12 tons of hammer can in a few blows transform an ingot of hot steel into the axle for a truck. When the iron trade took off again, Naismith's steam hammer became a vital tool in forging high-precision components for the mammoth locomotives, ships and bridges of the industrial age. "90 years ago, in the first decade of the 20th century, a new science was born in this very building in Manchester. It destroyed what we'd understood about the nature of matter, and it revealed the quite unexpected structure of the atom. Most 20th century science is done in teams, but this revelation was largely the work of one man, the new professor of physics, Ernest Rutherford. Rutherford was a New Zealander brought up on the family farm. He won a scholarship to Cambridge and then got appointed Professor of Physics in Montreal at the age of just 26, before being tempted back to head a crack research team in physics in Manchester. This was where Rutherford had his lab. Now, before that time, the smallest particle of any stuff was the atom. You had atoms of iron, for example, and they were indivisible, you couldn't break them up, and it was the way atoms combined together that made up the whole of chemistry. But in France, Henri Becquerel had discovered strange rays coming from elements like uranium. Rutherford decided to find out what this new radioactivity was. He got hold of some radioactive material. I'm using strontium-90. And just to show that it really is radioactive, I shall hold it in front of this sensitive instrument. Now, this instrument was invented in this very building by a chap called Hans Geiger, who was working for Rutherford, and ever since then it's been called a Geiger counter. After various tests, he came to a shocking conclusion. Radioactivity wasn't a ray like light, but a stream of peculiar new particles shooting out of the radioactive atoms. This was really weird. How could atoms of radioactive material spit out particles? Rutherford's explanation completely overthrew the idea of the indivisible atoms, because these atoms must actually be splitting. They must be breaking apart to throw out the particles, and in doing so, they themselves change into atoms of another element. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know what the inside of an atom was like. Rutherford was never more brilliant than when working out the structure of the atom. Hans Geiger and a New Zealander called Ernest Marsden were looking at what happens when you fired the new particles, Rutherford called them alpha particles, at a thin sheet of gold leaf. If you'll just imagine for a moment that the curtain hanging in the gull mouth is my sheet of very, very thin gold leaf, I'll show you what I mean. Here's my alpha particle, and I'm going to fire it at enormous velocity at that gold leaf. Just watch what happens. Absolutely straight through, and that was what happened generally because the alpha particles were going very, very fast and the gold leaf was very, very thin. But just occasionally some of them were scattered by quite significant angles, and that was really puzzling. They were struggling to explain why the particles got scattered in the way they did when Rutherford threw a spanner in the works. Rutherford came into the lab and he said, why don't you try putting the detector on this side, the same side as the source, to see if any of the particles are bounced right back off the gold leaf? And they said, that's ridiculous. And he said, well, try it anyway. So they tried it, and some of them did bounce absolutely straight back. Rutherford said it was the most incredible moment of his whole scientific career. He said it was as though you'd fired a 15-inch artillery shell at a piece of tissue paper and it had bounced straight off. And he went away and he thought about it, and one day he came into the lab particularly chirpy and said, I know what the atom looks like. Rutherford realised that to turn those alpha particles round, there must be something in the gold leaf that was very, very small, very heavy, with a very intense magnetic field. And this was what he worked out to be the structure of gold. This is gold leaf. And you see it's almost all empty space. Just every now and then there's a great concentration of mass in one tiny little spot, what we now call a nucleus, but all the rest was just gaps. And that was why the alpha particles were nearly all going straight through, because there was all this space in between, and every now and then one would come towards a nucleus and then it would bounce off. Now for some time people didn't believe him because this was so extraordinary. How could it all be empty space? But eventually they realised he must be right, and that was the beginning of the most exciting science of the 20th century, nuclear physics. Eventually, in 1919, Rutherford succeeded in splitting the atom, deliberately bombarding nitrogen atoms with alpha particles to disintegrate them and make new elements. Rutherford left behind an amazing legacy of science. He showed what radioactivity is, he discovered the nucleus, and he split the atom. But I'd like to show you something a bit more concrete here, lurking in a storeroom at Manchester University. This was his storage cabinet and his desk. And have a look at this. 80 years after he left, it's still radioactive. Sorry, that's all the heroes for this week. See you next time. If you would like to try some experiments from the programme, to visit some heroic sites, or just find out more about my heroes, details are on the Local Heroes website at www.bbc.co.uk/education.